Okay, so corridors and connectivity probably do branch out quite a bit too into restoration more generally, making it relevant to the context of the Darebin Creek. All right. So first of all, what is connectivity? Connectivity is the ability of plants and animals to move between habitat patches in the landscape. And typically we think about it through this sort of setup, this diagram, where we've got a large patch or a remnant and isolated patches around it that have become disconnected. And in ecological management, we've created corridors, and particularly in when you think about rural landscapes, this has been a very popular approach of creating vegetation corridors for plants and animals to move and share genetic material between them. And look, it's valuable, particularly where you have relatively intact ecological systems where they have a higher resilience, a higher capacity to regenerate. And you could even do it just through fencing off and keeping stock out. And you have enough of those ecological biotic factors that they can regenerate naturally. Without doing a whole lot, just putting back some of the key species. If you've got the intact soil structure and microbiota, then it can you can effectively recreate something like the natural state. But where we're dealing with the Darebin Creek, it's obviously a highly modified environment in an urban context. So connectivity for what becomes a question. And also just more broadly, connectivity is not as we sometimes see it. So in ecological management, it is that approach where it's based on a false assumption that the borders of local populations and communities are closed and they're isolated, and typically focus on spatial and temporal scales. So one place, one time, looking at a population or a community. But in ecological theory, we know that individuals disperse from one side to another. So it's called meta-community theory. And this is something I should acknowledge my former colleagues at Greening Australia, Dr. Elisa Rawlings and Martin Potts worked on a project out in East Gippsland applying this meta-community theory in relation to southern bell frogs there. So what are we talking about? Seemingly disconnected populations and communities, they do have a capacity for genetic exchange. So if we think about distinct wetlands in relation to each other and the Darebin Creek, there are populations of macroinvertebrates, frogs and fish that are isolated from each other in these wetlands. But if we have a big rainfall event like we did on Saturday, then suddenly they're connected and you will get dispersal of individuals in those circumstances. But even when we don't have those big events, it's surprising the capacity that different species have for dispersing across the landscape. Growling grass frogs are known to display classic metapopulation dynamics. So their discrete populations are interconnected by infrequent dispersal. So they can travel up to 1 kilometre in a 24-hour period. So this can help provide some context when we think about the Darebin Creek in our stretch, where there might be known populations of growling grass frogs, and we would like to encourage those by creating habitat for them that they can disperse to. So Graham and I were talking just the other day about Bundoora Park and the dam there, and where those frogs could potentially move along the creek downstream to the Beenak Reserve wetland, where they have been recorded in the past. Okay, so, whoops, sorry. Okay. So what role can connectivity play in our restoration? So when we think about our resources are scarce, we may not have the funding or resources to do large-scale plantings, for example, but if we can be smart about how we apply that, we can get the best outcomes for minimal input. So understanding dispersal and connectivity provides opportunity to achieve conservation outcomes with minimal input. working smarter and not harder. We can target our restoration efforts to allow nature, through connectivity, to do the work for us. So consider the dispersal mechanisms of the flora and fauna involved. If we think about plants, so the seed, if it's wildlife dispersed, water or wind, and you know, in Darebin Creek, the obvious one is, well, if it's water dispersed, let's concentrate our efforts further upstream so that we can let the dispersal downstream work for us. But also, if we're thinking about water birds, how can we attract those birds that we are known to be good dispersers of seed that we want? And if they're wind dispersed, well, where's the prevailing wind, and how can that work for us? So more broadly, what do we want to do through our interventions and our restoration? What natural assets do we want to enhance or recreate? So I've got a couple of examples here of, you know, some iconic species. So do we want to encourage powerful owls in the environment? So just thinking clearly about what are the biological needs for powerful owls? What are their habitat requirements? What do they feed on? Possums, as we can see here. So how can we encourage possums through creating habitat for the prey of those top order predators? Also, on the left, we've got Banksia marginata. So the inland variety of this species is critically endangered.
Speak of you.
And it came down to a few individuals in the Plenty Gorge. So it's good to see that this is being used quite widely now across the urban creeks as a revegetation species by land managers. Just out the back where I am on Edgar's Creek, because there's an easy win for us if we want to protect this species and enhance the environment locally by focusing on threatened species. But rather than just taking this general approach of creating connectivity through a variety of common native plants, we can think more clearly about what is it that we are exactly trying to achieve. And then focusing on the biological characteristics of those. What do we need to do to help them to recruit and to pollinate? Also, aside from biodiversity and species, increasing resilience, and this is becoming more and more important as we've got a lot of pressure from increasing populations and also climate change. How can we create a more resilient environment for all the traffic that is coming through our parks at the moment? And then for climate change, we can use those models and tools that are provided by the likes of the Bureau of Meteorology and the CSIRO when we look at climate analogous genetics. We know that it's going to become drier and warmer. So how can we enhance the ability of our local species to survive under those conditions? And this would have been heresy not too long ago in ecological management, where we've been taught for so long that we should only collect seed from within 50 kilometres or so, but all the evidence is showing us that there's a greater threat to our native plants and animals through genetic depression than there is through outcrossing, and particularly with the growing impacts of climate change. So we typically try to introduce at least 20% genetics from those drier, warmer climates. So I think for Melbourne, it's Wagga, but also even from those areas where it might be wetter and cooler, because we know that just having a high degree of genetic diversity, you're going to have much greater resilience in the population. But we might also want to look at what creating greater ecological function. So do we want our plants recruiting on site? Do we want a high degree of pollination? Do we want more species moving in as predators? How do we re-stimulate the decomposers in the environment? So how will we achieve our vision? In the past, with restoration, we've tended to focus on an idealised state in the history of the environment. So in Victoria, looking at ecological vegetation classes, which are deduced from historical evidence to be based on what the environment might have looked like pre-1770 and colonisation. But ecological systems are dynamic, they're always changing, and they've been irrevocably changed in our environment. So what is it that we are trying to do? By just trying to get it back to what it would have been in 1770, does that make sense anymore? Or is it about playing a role in the broader environmental context of an urban environment? So maybe there might be some plants and animals that wouldn't be there now, but they've got nowhere else to go. So we're creating a different environment for a new context. We're dealing with systems that are so dramatically disturbed. The soil structure and the nutrients and the biota are radically changed. So you'll find out with the fungi talk, the critically important role that fungi plays in the soil, and the mycorrhizal fungi through symbiosis with plants, sharing nutrients across the whole system between plants, and also bacteria. When these are removed from the soil, it's very difficult for a lot of our native plants to grow without their symbiotic partners. And some introduced fungi that have come in on exotic plants can actually be toxic for native plants. So it's kind of a creative process as well. Once you decide what you're wanting to achieve, it's understanding the biology of those plants or animals that you want to encourage, or the system or the functions, and tailoring your interventions to meet those needs. It's also important to recognise that as an urban environment, aesthetics and things like sightlines are important too, that need to be considered. Understanding the reproductive biology of the plants is very important. So is it sexual or asexual? Are they dioecious? So do they have male and female plants? So I've got a photo here of the drooping sheath. You can see on the on the left is the male. So it's the pollen here, and on the right we've got the female with the cones. So this is a wind pollinated plant. So if we want that to reproduce, we want to think about where we plant the males in relation to the females, so that you have the prevailing winds heading the right direction, so we can maximise recruitment opportunities. So here's an example of a plant that has a vegetative way of expansion rather than sexual. So this is Melaleuca ericofolia, swamp paperbark. Not uncommon along the creek, but be hard pressed to find any this large. Peter Grenfell and we did come across, there's a good specimen further upstream, but nothing quite to this extent. You can see that these can be quite expansive. This is all just one plant, but this is the tactic that it plays in terms of accessing water. As a semi-aquatic, it needs to have its feet wet. So in revegetation, you don't want to be planting a whole lot of these. You probably only want to plant one, and you want to make sure that it has the space to move and colonize surrounding areas. So it will, on a bank situation in a creek, it needs to be able to move up and down. So it doesn't get flooded out if it's too low, doesn't dry out too much at the top, but it can move and die off. How we measure success? Well, aside from those features we talk about, if we're looking for a general approach, there are standards. So national standards for the practice of ecological restoration in Australia. This is what we're applying at Darebin Creek Management Committee. And within those, we have these 1 to 5 star ratings. Oops, sorry, I'm just trying to move this. I can't see it, but you can see the attributes down the side here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 attributes. And the final one, external exchanges, actually has some statements around the connectivity. So connectivity increasing and exchanges between site and external environments starting to be evident. This is where I just sort of talk about our emerging partnership with the La Trobe University, the Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung and Melbourne Water working on Nanyuck Tamboree. So this is La Trobe land. It's a 12-hectare site, highly degraded grassy eucalypt woodland, but it does have some remnant features in there, some red gums, where some kids have let a fire go, the kangaroo grass has come back. So even though there's a bunch of weeds there, where the plan is that over the staged process of 3 years, the Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung, using cultural burns, will clear up a lot of the weeds and then do follow-up to see what recruitment can come back from the seed bank. Hopefully there's some Indigenous seeds still there hiding underneath all the weeds. We're pretty optimistic that it will, because just to the south of there, Banyule have done extensive works over a period of years, and they've had some really good natural recruitment come back. It's a really good example of creating connectivity, because it is immediately to the north of this site, and what we'd hope over time is that we will see that exchange, we will see that pollination between the two sites and those species starting to interact. We will probably need to intervene in that, but it's a learning process as well as you go. And the other thing I should say is Neil Davis in the approach with the woodland birds in getting the habitat back through small shrubs that provides the sort of cover and preference for woodland birds is a good example of having that mindful approach to connectivity. So you've got a clear outcome you want to encourage these woodland birds that fit this niche, so you create that structure in the habitat with those preferred species, and then you can monitor that over time. Important to just get that baseline monitoring done and the photographs before you start the intervention, and then monitoring over time so you can show the improvement and show that you've reached your goals. That narrative becomes an important part of the process. But yeah, that's pretty much it. If anyone would like to ask any questions about any of that.
Can you repeat the name of the document?
This is the national standards, the standards for ecological restoration.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
Margaret, it may be that people have other questions and just sequence this, but I thought it might be interesting just to show the work that's actually Neil Masters, Jenny, that Neil and Ryan Robertson have done in Reach 4 in trying to look at the veg habitat for small woodland birds. And I've got the map just as an illustration of a way to try and get practically into the issues of connectivity. So if you'd like, I could do that at some point, but see what other questions you've got.
Okay, John. Yep, I think Elizabeth, you were going to ask a question, and then we could look at that map, John. You're muted, Elizabeth.
I didn't have a question in mind.
Oh, okay. Sorry. Anybody else want to make any comments or reflect on anything that Danny has said?
Yeah, I'll make a comment. Thank you, Danny. That was really, really informative. I suppose I'm thinking, because we're specifically involved in the revegetation along the back of Green Street, which is a little bit up from the parklands. I'm thinking about connectivity from where we are and the Darebin parklands, and what maybe we need to be thinking about, or how to approach getting more connectivity. I don't know if you've got any ideas about that or suggestions.
Yeah, well, I think it's looking at that idea of connectivity for what. So what features are you trying to promote? What are the values that are there, or something that you might like to introduce?
Well, I suppose on a very general level, it's yeah, getting habitat for, so increasing the native flora, for habitat for native fauna.
Yeah.
That's a very, I don't know if you want to put anything else in there, Chris.
Well, yeah, I was thinking of things like frogs, for example. I'm in the same section as Michelle, and in our section there aren't any frogs, and if there are any, I have a feeling that they get washed down the creek whenever there's a flood. So how can we have a section that where we can keep and retain frogs so that they don't get washed away, and so that we're connected to what's downstream, and as well as if anything's coming upstream, from upstream. One of the things that we've tried to do in our section is that where the section, because we're just north of the parklands, where it narrows significantly, and one of our mission statements for our Green Street group is to try and broaden the wildlife corridor there by getting, because we all own the land along the northern side, what we've tried to do is have one of our mission statements is to get people to plant native in their backyard. So as part of our Melbourne Water Grant, we're trying to encourage them to, and been quite successful in that the backyards help to widen the corridor. The trouble is that there are things like fences and then people walking dogs that are off leash and things like that, but we're trying to do what we can to broaden it at that point, because that's the point where connectivity otherwise is cut off, and any tips that we can have in how to go about that would be good. We try and do a lot of biodiversity so that something there will suit. And in fact, when you said the Banksia, like we've got several Banksia marginata growing, so that's part of it. But what else can we do as our group? Because we've got 12 houses all along there that are, the whole section is connected.
Yeah. Yeah, well, it's having that focus and that clear focus on, rather than just the general connectivity. But if you've got to focus on, you want to encourage frogs, then what do frogs need? So wetlands, logs, rocks, things like that. You might not be able to have a big wetland there, but you could have, if it's in your backyard, you could put in a frog bog, put in a pond, and that's going to encourage those frogs there. And then you will get that dispersal if you've got the habitat from other sites, north and south. But yeah, so not so much the plants, but other habitat features.
Yeah, I mean, there's a whole pile. We're trying to encourage whatever we can, flora, fauna, anything. I mentioned frogs as an example, the same as there was a sightings of turtles, the eastern turtle, I think it was. And then somebody said, oh, there's koalas that they're thinking are coming down from the top end of the creek. I don't know if that's true or not, but we planted a whole pile of eucalypts then that were koala friendly for should they ever come to our point.
Yeah.
Just like guidance of what is realistic rather than idealistic.
Yeah, well, I certainly think it's realistic to expect frogs if you put in frog bogs in your gardens, and you can look that up on YouTube.
Yeah, Michelle's got a frog bog, so the trouble is the frogs haven't come, have they?
I think because ours isn't getting enough sun, we need to relocate.
Right.
I think is the issue, yeah.
Yeah. And the other thing that's realistic is certainly birds moving through the corridor. So if you're planning the right habitat for those birds, like a Reach 4 group, you know, looking at those shrubs that will encourage those woodland birds that will come through. But equally, you know, there's a lot of birds moving through that corridor. So if you've got nectar producing plants, that's going to encourage a lot of birds. But yeah, I think, coming back to just if it's frogs or if it's particular species, understanding what their particular needs are and then tailoring it for those is what's going to encourage them. Because sometimes it will just be, you know, it's not just having a big diversity of everything, it's having lots of the things that they like, you know, so you plant them really densely, and that's going to encourage whatever species it is that you want to encourage, so long as they can disperse into that site.
Jeff has a question. Jeff Nixon.
Yes, thanks, Margaret. Hi, Danny. I was quite impressed by the owl with the possum in the claws earlier in your presentation. I didn't think possums had too many predators. So the owls, what sort of owl was it? Are there many owls in the area, and was that a little possum, or do they take all sizes of possums?
That's a powerful owl. They're very big birds, top order carnivore. They will take brushtails as well as ringtails.
Right.
They do frequent the area. The City of Yarra have a project at the moment working on tracking the powerful owls that are moving through the corridor right across the Yarra and up the tributaries. And yeah, they've got a very large area that they travel through, including coming into Darebin Parklands and feeding on. They've got a lot of food. There's a lot of possums in the urban environment, so they've moved in after them. So yeah, it's very interesting. If you see them, they're amazing big animals. If you get a chance. Yeah.
Well, I rarely see an owl, and if I do, it's only by chance. What was I going to say? Are they? You said there's a project to track them. Does that mean they're also looking to count how many, do it a census perhaps as well?
Well, yeah, they're actually tracking an individual. I'm not sure if they're counting the numbers. They have, because they're such a large animal, there's only so many that can be supported across. They have a large area that they're taking possums from. So they can't. It takes a lot of possums to support an owl.
Well, I've got a few they can have.
Yeah. But no, they're right in the Treasury Gardens as well, being the possums. So
do they? I know in Banyule Council in Rosanna Parklands, for example, they put up little tree boxes, I think they're tree boxes, up on the pines or the conifers. Do they do the same things for the owls, or they just let them, I don't know, find their own home?
I'm not sure if it's been done in Melbourne, but I know of projects out in the Strzelecki Ranges where they're working on creating nesting boxes for powerful owls with chainsaws. They're obviously big hollows that they require. So yeah, it can be done. Trying to remember where Craig said there's one nesting. They do go back to regular roosts, and you'll just see them sitting in the tops of the trees as well. They don't necessarily need hollows. They'll just roost up on the top of the tree.
Right. Okay. So I assume they're in more. Well, I thought they would be, as they're powerful owls. Once again, I've never heard of a powerful owl before. From what you say, they're quite sizable. So, but they're in the urban area then.
Yeah, very much so. They're endangered. But this is where we're finding, as the environment outside of the urban area becomes degraded, it's very nutrient rich in urban environments. We've got, as everyone knows, there's possums everywhere. So it's highly productive, highly productive system in the urban environments. If you get enough possums, they'll come in and they'll eat it. So there's lots of interesting wildlife that's moving into urban environments. Talking with Peter, talked about all the currawongs that have moved in in recent years that never used to be in urban environments, and he suggested that since the Black Saturday fires. So they've moved in because their environment becomes degraded elsewhere. They find there's enough food in these nutrient-rich places in town, so they set up.
Right. Okay. Thanks, Danny. Good to know.
Thanks, Jeff. Okay, if there's no other questions, John, let's go over to you. And yeah, this is an interesting activity that the Reach 4 group is doing.
So I need you or Danny to share the screen. You can just do it down on share screen, yeah?
Danny, you'll become the host, so...
Oh, have I? Oh, okay.
So just on share screen, if you open it up to multiple. Yep.
Right, all right. Okay, you're co-host.
All right, so, okay. So this is one so let's see if I've got this. Okay, so you can see this. So this is a segment of a larger map, and I'll just explain the context of it.
Yeah.
So we have, within Friends of Darebin Creek, we've got a working group on Reach 4 of the creek, and Reach 4 is Reach 4 as designated in the Darebin Creek Management Plan, in which there's 6 reaches coming down from the top, 1 through the rural areas, 2 and 3 through Whittlesea, and then we are from the Ring Road to Plenty Road, and 5 is to Bell Street, and then 6 is Bell Street to the Yarra. So in Reach 4, we've had a range of activities and a working group going for the last 18 months or so. And as part of this, Danny gave us a presentation that he has just given us all today. And that stimulated us to thinking about, well, how do you go a next step to sort of operationalise the approach to connectivity or biodiversity corridor, if you frame it that way. And we reckon that it should be done by focusing on species that you wanted to connect or are absent, and the 2 species we started to identify then a focus on small woodland birds and frogs. And Neil Masters, who is the biodiversity manager for Metro Trains, Neil, and lives in the area, has a very strong interest in small woodland birds. So we've taken that, and in a separate document, Neil has identified what birds we're talking about and what kind of habitat they need. So I've got that there, but you wouldn't be able to read it easily on the screen. So then what we did was, and this is really Ryan Robertson with his spatial skills, and Neil with his knowledge of what he's looking at in terms of habitat. We've gone through and done this mapping of the status of the creek in respect of habitat for small woodland birds, and we need to make sure that if we're talking about increasing habitat for them, that we're not ignoring other species. And so this is really in the creek banks, the riparian zone that we're looking at. And you'll see there's a little key, it's not so easy to see, but it's a traffic light one of green, habitat good, orange, intervention required, and red, minimal vegetation. And then we've got some more expansive legends that we're still working on. Anyway, so what we've done is started from down the bottom here. So this is Plenty Road. And down the bottom here is, and this happens to be just the end of the map that Ryan had, that he was using. But down here, there's good habitat. This is the Latrobe area through here. And this is the sort of space, this sort of space that Danny's talking about in terms of habitat development. But there's good habitat down here for small woodland birds. So we're looking at potentially connection of those up the creek. So this first map then maps all this section of the creek through KP Hardeman Reserve as orange. Then we get to some areas that we would say are red, some that are green because of fairly recent and more recent plantings. And then we get into another segment which is taking us up to Dunn Street. So this is the Broadway Drain and the Bowls Club. So you can see the plot. And so then we've gone around this area here, which takes us Benak Reserve, where Melbourne Water has recently done plantings in this area and this area here, but mostly of trees and grasses rather than the more the plant-based habitat and lower on the bank habitat that Neil would have for small woodland birds. So we've then continued this, so this is up through now we're going up through Bundura Park, and we flipped across here. We've got a full map of all this, but it gets pretty small. So you'll get the picture. And then we keep on going up around Bundura Park, the golf course, heading up, and then we sort of head really into Whittlesea. And into Whittlesea, we go around Norris Bank and further on, and then up to the Ring Road. So our view would be that all of the Whittlesea section has minimal vegetation, and then it's a little bit patchwork down through City of Darebin. Our next steps really are to test this a bit more, to put more of the codes in, which is, whether there's canopy present or lacking, etc. But then begin to suggestions of being able to prioritise where you might increase the habitat by enhancing existing good patches, or you won't necessarily try to deal with all of those that require significant intervention because so many of them. So we're still trying to work out those priorities. And then we see this as with Neil's description of what we're trying, the species we're looking at, the birds and the kind of habitat, that we've now got a concept that we can hopefully discuss with Melbourne Water and with the City of Darebin in particular, and Danny is kind of working on that sort of communication structure. So we're hoping that this is a line of thought that operationalises that notion of connectivity or biodiversity corridor. Obviously it can be expanded for other species, and it can be expanded beyond the river banks, but this is where we've got to so far.
Yeah, I guess I was just wanted to say, yeah, it's a good example of having that focus for those particular species and what their habitat needs are. So, Neil's come up with a species list of those shrubs that provide that specific habitat to encourage those species back in. So that just makes it a lot more achievable than, having a broad brush approach. Just go, oh, okay, well, what should be here, and getting a bit of everything. But just having that focus, it then gives you something that you can measure as well in terms of change. So you expect, you know that these plants provide habitat for these animals, so we expect that by putting them back, we will encourage them back in.
So something like that could be done down near Green Street, for instance,
I'd be very interested to get a list of which particular plants you've identified for the woodland birds.
Yeah, I'll just try another share, just see if I can do it. I don't know if I've got it there. I've probably got it here. Okay. Okay, so Neil has done this, as to what birds are we thinking about? Yeah. Where are they located in Darebin Creek area? And so here's where we identify around us, reach for, is we identify the Latrobe Uni. What kind of habitat do they need? So, right? And what would it need to be done to extend their habitat? So we've got it, and so this has then taken us to this point. Yeah. So that's the material that kind of goes with this mapping. Yeah. make that available if you want.
Yeah.
How do we get hold of that?
Yeah. Easy. We can, well, however we do it, we can send it out. Yeah.
Or maybe if you could, if it's okay, if you could email it to Margaret and
Yeah.
she can
Yeah.
email it on, if that's
Yep.
okay.
Yeah, Margaret's got it. Yeah, that's easily done.
Thank you.
And then we've got a sort of, you know, this is the full map of the whole reach, you know, but I didn't start with that, but you get a sense there of the reach and the, you know, the overall structure, and there's very little green in terms of appropriate habitat.